My name is Joe Insley. I'm the team lead for visualization and analysis at the Leadership Computing Facility at Argonne National Lab. And so here's a brief rundown of some of the Viz stuff that we're going to talk about today. So I'll do a little bit of an introduction. Myself and Silvio Rizzi, who's also a scientist on our team. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the introduction's going to cover in my next slide. But so we go till, 10:15 when we take a break. Maybe a little bit later than that, depending. And then Dave DeMarle from Kitwares here is going to talk about peer review. And we have, that'll go up until lunchtime. After lunch, Cyrus Harrison from Lawrence Livermore will talk to us and do some hands-on stuff with Visit. We'll take another break. John Stone from UIUC is going to talk about molecular dynamics and visualization and things in that space. And then we're going to explore a little bit of doing visualization in Jupyter notebooks before our dinner talk tonight. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in. So here's the plan for this morning session, this intro session. So I'll give some examples of different visualizations, talk a little bit about resources, in particular the Cooley, the resource at Argonne that we'll use as part of the hands-on today. Talk a little bit about tools and formats, and then talk about the bulk of what I'm going to talk about is different types of data representations, right? How you take your data and represent it in some visual form. And that's going to come in handy when we start going and diving into the tools a little bit later. You'll get an idea of how to use those tools to do these different types of representations that I'm going to talk about. I'll talk a little bit about visualization for debugging, right? So sometimes the visualization is not, the final output, right? It's not always the flashy picture at the end that you're looking for, but sometimes you can use visualization to get some idea of what's happening in your code, right? And so I'll show a couple examples of that. And then I'm going to turn things over to Silvio, and he's going to talk about in situ visualization and analysis. Right, so as the scale of our resources continue to grow, one of the biggest bottlenecks continues to be, and this gap is widening, of we can't write data to disk as fast as we can compute it, right? And so, especially as we move into exascale, that becomes a problem, right? Because we end up having to throw a lot of data away, right? So to mitigate that, there's been a pretty large effort in the community looking at in situ visualization analysis. So trying to do this viz and analysis on the data while it's still in memory before it gets thrown away, essentially. And so Silvia's going to talk some about that. So a few examples of visualization. So this is from a project that I've worked with this team off and on for about the last 10 or 15 years. And it's really a multi-scale simulation and visualization problem. So what we're looking at, these are arteries in the brain. And in particular, what they're interested in is this aneurysm, where this place where this essentially a weakness in the wall of the artery is formed. And they're interested in understanding how the flow patterns in this structure impact particle buildup of blood platelets on the wall of this aneurysm that could cause the aneurysm to burst or a chunk of this clot essentially to break free and cause obstructions downstream, right? And so in this case, they're coupling a fluid dynamics code that's doing the larger scale approximation of the flow in the overall system, and coupling that with a particle dynamics code that's keeping track of the individual particles in this small subregion that you see there at the end of the aneurysm. Because there's not, even with today's resources, there's not enough compute power to do the particle dynamics level of detail in the entire system. So they couple these two codes together. An example of climate. where they're taking observed data and using that as the input to their models, and then simulating forward, and then they can go back and look at how statistically how their models are performing compared to observations, and then build on that and make improvements to their codes. This is an example of aerospace where they're looking at noise from a jet nozzle, right? And so they're interested in understanding how to reduce noise, not only for reducing noise pollution, but it also turns out leads to better fuel efficiency as well. So there's an example of that. There's also some, here's a handful of different examples from material science, looking at molecular structures. And I'll show some more examples of some of the tools and how they work with these types of data. Cosmology, lots of large-scale simulations dealing with this, especially on our resources. And so this is using the example from this visualization using one of our tools that we've built. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So resources. So Cooley is our visit analytics cluster. It's a 126 node cluster at the ALCF, which you may or may not have used already, but you'll have access to. So each node has 384 gigs of RAM and an NVIDIA, a little bit older video card by now, but still decent, the K80s, with 24 gigs of texture memory. And one of the critical parts about the system is that it shares a file system with Mira and Theta, which are our two primary compute resources. Right, so I mentioned this bottleneck before, but currently one of the primary methods for doing visualization analysis is post hoc. Right, so you write all your data to disk, and then you go back and visualize it and analyze it later. Because we're talking about terabytes of data, petabytes perhaps, we don't want to have to move that data, and a lot of times it's impractical. People don't have the bandwidth and or the storage at their home institution to be moving data around like that. So we can leverage Cooley to read data back off the same file systems and do their visualization remotely. So a little bit about some tools and data formats. So there's all sorts of tools out there for doing visualization. This is by no means an exhaustive list. The ones highlighted in blue are things that we have available on Cooley. And so Visit and PairView, which you'll hear more about a little bit later today, are visualization applications, right? And so they're general purpose, high performant, parallel, open source viz tools, end user tools largely. And then there's others, I mentioned those are sort of general purpose. I don't know if that's quite the right way to put it, but they can apply to many data from many disciplines, as opposed to, there's other tools that are more sort of domain specific, VMD being one of them, and John will talk a little bit more about that this afternoon as well. And then there's APIs. So for example, VTK, the visualization toolkit, is an API for building environments and applications. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. There's others that, for example, leverage GPU hardware. So for example, VL3, this is the volume-based, shader-based volume rendering and particle rendering tool that was developed at Argonne and University of Chicago. So like, for example, the Cosmology image I showed a second ago was rendered with that. And a couple of others, utilities and other resources. Again, this is not by any means an exhaustive list, but some that you should probably be familiar with. So a little bit of more specifics now about visit and pair view versus VTK, right? So as I mentioned, pair view and visit are these general purpose visualization applications. They're GUI based, client-server model in order to support remote visualization. So you can run essentially a server on multiple nodes of our visualization cluster, and then connect to that with a lightweight client that you run on your laptop, desktop, right? And so all the heavy lifting happens on the cluster, and essentially just images can get transported over the wide area. Both of these tools are scriptable and extensible. So we primarily, as I mentioned, it's GUI based, but you can also use both of them in batch, right? And so generally the way we use it is interactively to sort of set up our pipelines and understand what it is that we're looking for and do the interactive stuff that way. And then based on what we discovered in that process, save out essentially the state of our visualizations and our pipelines, and then use those to build scripts that enable us to then go off and submit batch jobs to render animations, for example. Both of these tools are largely built on top of VTK. And again, they both offer some of these in situ capabilities that I mentioned a bit ago. So in contrast to VTK, it's more of a programming environment, API. There are some additional capabilities there. It gives you some finer control, potentially a smaller memory footprint than some of the other tools, but it requires a lot more expertise, right? And so basically you end up building custom applications. Or you can use these APIs to build plugins for these other tools, right? So Visit and PairView both have Python interfaces that enable you to extend and write your own data readers, for example. Speaking of which, both of these tools have, and again, this is not an exhaustive list of data file formats that these tools are capable of reading. As you're probably well aware by now, that the structure that data needs to be in order to take advantage of the hardware that these applications are running on takes a very particular data format, sort of customized to the architecture you're running on. That's generally pretty different than the format data needs to be in order to do visualization. And so there's actually quite a bit of time that we spend sort of doing that sort of data wrangling of sort of converting from one format to another. And so this is, again, just a list of some of the data file formats that these tools natively support already. And again, there's ways to create plugins if you have data in some different format that the tools don't already know about. So I'll switch over now to talk more about different types of representations, right? What do you want to do with your data now that you've computed it? So one method is called volume rendering, you may be familiar with, which is essentially taking a 3D volume of data and assigning some, for each value in your data set or range of values, assigning some color and or transparency level, right? So for example, our little mouse friend up here, right? I can say that, I know that a particular range of density values corresponds to bone. And so I can set a color range for bone. I have another range of values that's for muscle or some other particular density values for other known structures. And so I can assign values to particular colors to particular data ranges and transparency levels as well. Similarly, this one on the lower right is basically two fluids that are mixing, right? And based on temperature. And so places where it's blue, the temperature is low, where it's red, it's high. And basically, we're casting rays into these, through these data sets, taking samples along the rays, and then adding up the values of those samples. So lots of different data from many different domains sort of fall into this sort of representation could be used for. So glyphs, right, are another representation. It's basically 2D or 3D geometric objects are used to represent point data. So location is dictated by the coordinate, whether it's a 3D location on a mesh, or perhaps a 2D position in a table or a graph, for example. And then largely what Viz is in general really is taking attributes of the data and assigning them to graphical attributes, right? So for example, here we're saying in the center one, this is a bunch of particles that are flowing through a tube, and we're sort of looking at this tube head on. And so the color represents their velocity, right? So you can see the ones around the edge are sort of blue and then green, and those ones are slower because they're bumping into the walls of this tube they're flowing through. Friction's causing them to slow down. The ones in the center are moving much faster because they're not incurring that friction. And so we can see by looking here that, those are the sort of the results we would expect to see. And we're using, again, these graphical attributes to represent different attributes in the data. Again, here we're looking at velocity vectors. Similarly, they're colored by their velocity, but they're also using a vector to dictate their direction that they're pointing. So contours or isosurfaces are another common representation. So in 2D, this would be a line or a surface in 3D. And it's basically representing a constant value throughout a data set. And Visit and PairView are both good at this. VTK, same again, but it can require a little bit more effort. And so I'll talk a little bit about a couple of different examples here. On the upper right there, in this case, there's multiple surfaces, each one of them colored by the value of that surface, right? So there's multiple isosurfaces as opposed to in this lower one on the left, there's actually a single surface, but then we can also project that a second variable onto that surface. And so in the top example, each separate surface is a different color. In this bottom case, they're all the same. The surface value is all the same, but it's colored by a second variable. And so there's a way to combine to get different variables to display additional information. So cutting planes are another common representation, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a slice or a plane that you cut through the data and then color it by a particular variable. Again, Visit and PairView are really good at this. There's also some similar capabilities in VMD. So streamlines is a way of looking at a vector field. In this case, it's from a vector field on a mesh, so it needs connectivity. And essentially what we're showing here is the direction an element would travel at any point in time. So within a single time step, we take a bunch of seed points, place them in the mesh, and then basically follow the vector path from one cell to the next based on the vector that it finds there, right? And so this is all within a single time step. And again, Visit and PairView really good at this. You can also do path lines or trace lines, which in that case, there's also, it takes time into account, right? And so it goes from one time step to the next and follows the path over time, as opposed to within a single time step. Obviously, that's a little bit more computationally expensive, and you need to be able to load multiple time steps in order to calculate those. So that's one of the main differences there. So I mentioned that some visualizations are more domain specific. So for example, molecular dynamics visualization, again, VMD has lots of domain specific representations that can be used for this. There's other tools as well. Again, you can do animation, and these tools are scriptable. Visit and pair view are, I would say, improving in this area. This has not been their main focus for doing sort of the domain-specific stuff. But there is some support for it, and that's been growing. And VTK, of course, anything's possible if you try hard enough. So there's a couple more slides from me before I pass it on to Silvio. Talking a little bit about using visualization for debugging. Right, so I like to show this example because I was working with a team. It's actually the same people that did the fluid flow, the blood flow I showed at the beginning. And what this is it's a fluid flow example where we have two propellers, and they're going to rotate in opposite directions. And the fluid flow is going to flow from right to left. And so they had some abnormality. Something was going wrong with their code, and they didn't quite understand why. And so they asked me to help visualize. And so keep your eye on the propeller on the right, which is actually the front propeller. Right? So by the time they got to the end of the simulation, that propeller was gone. Right? So they had some bug in their code where something wasn't being reinitialized. And so the propeller went away. And so, of course, the effects of that propeller went away. And so they were not getting anywhere near the results they were expecting. Right? And so there's a case where the visualization helped them understand that that's what was going on in the data. So this is what they were expecting to get. And you can kind of see underneath here, there's a little bit of white here. That's where the actual propellers are. And these blue structures are the vorticity structures they were expecting to see, and they weren't. And then here's another case where we're actually using visualization for diagnostics. So for example, I mentioned this cosmology visualization that we've done. It's actually a volume renderer that can support data from many different domains, but we were trying to optimize it, add some threading to it, and we weren't quite getting the speed up we were expecting. So one of the things that we wanted to look at is, well, how are we distributing the work among the threads, right? So in this case, we took our code, and then instead of when we do our raycasting and looking up our values, rather than assigning the value that it found in the data, we assigned a value of the ID of the thread that was doing the work. And so by changing the way that we were doing that distribution, we can see that we have four very different layouts of how the threads are assigned to where they live, what parts of the data that they're working on. Now, I can't tell you off the top of my head which one of these was most performant, but we definitely saw a change in performance based on the way that the data was laid out among the threads. And so just another example of using visualization to help understand the problem that you're trying to address. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Silvio to talk about in situ viz.
All right. Thanks, Joe. So Joe already introduced the concept of in situ viz and analysis. Let's see, it's not going to stay there. Briefly, the problem is that the flops are increasing, but the I/O, the storage and bandwidth is not increasing that fast as the flops, right? So there's something we need to do there. We can't store all the data generated by a simulation. So there are possibilities that we may be missing something important there. So that is what in situ viz analysis tries to address. That's the problem that we're trying to solve. There's within DOE, there's two projects that we are kind of involved in. So in one way or another, right? So one of them is the SENSEI in Situ project, and this is actually a collaboration. It's a multi-institutional collaboration between national labs and companies. So there's Berkeley, there is Argonne and Oak Ridge involved in this. And as companies, we have Intelligent Light, so they work mainly with, or they contribute to Visit and Kitware. So what's the need? Well, we already said that that there's this increasing gap between flops and I/O. The SENSEI project proposes two different things here as part of our approach. So one is to create a specific data model or define a specific data model. And that data model is based on VTK. So Joe already described VTK. VTK is a library that's been around for decades, and they have an extensive data model to cover most of the simulations, most of the data that simulations will provide. So that was a good option. And it allows us also to provide visit and peer review backends for SENSEI. The other main aspect of SENSEI and its design is an API, a common API, to instrument the simulation code. So this is essentially a picture describing what the design looks like, right? So simulation on your left, there's SENSEI in the middle, like gluing everything together. And on the right, there's the different, and it's a sample, in fact. That's not all the backends that are supported, but those are the most important at this time, right? Including Catalyst, which is the in situ version of peer review, LiveSim for Visit, Adios from Oak Ridge, which is a library mostly for data movement, and there's Python, YT, VTKM, Ascent, and C++ as well. So one of the main things in the design of SENSEI is to write the algorithm once and run everywhere. So that means that once your simulation is instrumented, you could, in fact, change the backends, and things should still run. There's a little bit more detail here in terms of how things are structured. There's three main components in SENSEI. There's a data adapter that is essentially grabbing the data from the simulation and putting it in VTK mode, in VTK data model. And one important thing here is that we try to take advantage of the zero copy mechanisms in VTK. So the idea is to pass pointers, but not duplicate the data. So we do that when it's possible. In most cases, it is possible. There is a configurable analysis adapter on the right side. And that, I'll show in a moment how it takes XML configuration files, and you can easily change the backend that you're going to use. And there's this bridge code gluing everything together. So the data adapter implements the SENSEI API. and it gets the data from the simulation. Then there's the different analysis adapters. Here we're showing the configurable analysis adapter, but you can write your own analysis adapter and make it part of SENSEI as well. There is an XML file that will select at runtime one of the possible backends. And this is what the code, essentially, what a very simplified version of a simulation code instrumented with SENSEI looks like. So we are adding the lines in blue here. And keep this in mind, when we talk about ascent, there will be a very similar structure here. So a simulation code, the first thing that it will do is initialize, right? So immediately after that, we also initialize the code in the bridge, and it takes care of initializing everything on the SENSEI side. So then we're representing a loop for the simulation, right? Compute new state, and if there's I/O to do, just write something. In that case, when the code is instrumented, we will call the bridge execute. And at this time, we're passing the data to the other side to do analysis on this. Finally, when the simulation loop is done, or it's finished, first, before finalizing the simulation, we need to finalize all the libraries in SENSEI. So we call bridge finalize and then finalize the sim. So it's simple, and it's if you look at the repo, I'm going to provide a link to the repo. There are many apps instrumented like this, and it's really simple to write that code. So it's just a few lines of code that you need to add to your simulation code to instrument it. So this is a brief example of what the XML configuration file looks like to select one of the possible backends for the configurable analysis adapter, right? So 3 different entries here for different analysis, histogram in the first, and also histogram in the second. But the first entry is, in fact, grabbing atoms of array, and the array, the data that is grabbing is type, right? So the type of atom. The second case is using, again, the same mesh called atoms, but it's, in fact, analyzing the particle or the atom ID, right? And there's this enabled field. So if you put it at 0, this will not execute. If you put it in 1, it will execute, as you would expect. It is also possible to write, even though we try to avoid writing to disk, but if you want to, you can write the data that you're receiving as BTK files. So that's the BTK post-hoc I/O analysis adapter. You can enable it too. So what you do, for example, if you want to use the Catalyst backend, one possibility is to use ParaView, and Dave is going to show ParaView in detail and its interface. But the point I want to make here is that it's really simple to just load a subset of your data in ParaView, create the pipeline that you want to execute, right? In this case, it's essentially grabbing atoms and showing them as sphere glyphs, right? And after that, this is an older version of ParaView 5.5.2. Things may look a little bit different in newer versions, but the concept is the same. There's a menu where you can generate and export a Python script representing or actually doing all these operations, right? That Python script is what we will feed to the Catalyst analysis adapter. And you can see it here, right? In this specific part of XML code. We're telling it, okay, your backend is going to be Catalyst. You'll be executing a Python script. And this is the Python script that we exported from the ParaView interface. It's as simple as that. And then when you do this and run the simulation, every time step, every time there's new data, a picture will be generated like that. This is another example, a little bit more complex. This is from Will Asher at University of Utah. The example here is about instrumenting LAMPS, a well-known simulation code for molecular dynamics. It's instrumented with SENSEI. It's moving data. This is called in-transit data analysis, when the data is moved from the simulation nodes to a subset of nodes doing analysis or visualization. And in the analysis side, it's doing interactive visualization of the data, right? It is using a library from Intel, specialized in ray tracing with high performance on Intel CPUs. That library is called Osprey. And I'm going to show a brief demo of that. So I'm going to pause here. Essentially, you're seeing 3 terminals here. The one on the top is, in fact, running the simulation, which is already instrumented. So that is LAMPS. That, if you're familiar with LAMPS, you'll see these messages, right, that are common in LAMPS. So that is the simulation. It's providing the data through SENSEI, and we have an analysis, a data adapter for that. The one in the middle, in fact, is going to launch the analysis part, which is doing the rendering of it. So it's receiving the data through the network. It's doing the rendering with Osprey. And the third here is the interactive client. The third window here will launch an interactive client. So you will see a window there, which the user can modify. So with that, we can continue playing the animation. Now you can see that the analysis and visualization part is launching, and it will start receiving data through the network. And now the client is executing. So this is what the user can see. And this client can be remote. Here we're showing it in a single, for simplicity, right, to capture the video. Everything is running on a single node, but the client can be remote. So there you can see how the data, the simulation is providing data live. We're rendering it, and the analyst, in fact, can change perspectives there, or zoom in, zoom out, trying to find interesting things. So with that, we can move on to the other project that I would like to show, and we're trying to support these 2 projects at ALCF, especially with an eye on the new machines coming, or the exascale machines. So this is Ascent, and the slides that I'm going to show were part of the ECP annual meeting in January. And we have Cyrus from this team here in the room. So it's just a brief overview of Ascent. There's 2 main aspects here. So when they designed it, one of the things was, again, an easy-to-use API. And the second important aspect is it's got to be lightweight, right? So for that, there's 3 main use cases that they define: making picture, transforming data, or capturing data. As a data model, it uses Conduit from Livermore. And again, Cyrus is an expert if you have questions or are interested in that. It also uses VTKM from Kidware, and this is part also of the ECP Exascale Computing Project. So VTKM is essentially a library or a software project to take advantage of multicore, right? To take advantage of the parallelism on the same node. And remember, I mentioned that pseudocode and SENSEI, and here things are really similar, right? So when you want to use Ascent to instrument your application, you just do an Ascent open, and then when there's new data, you just publish that data, execute it to do the analysis, and then close when you're done. So things that Ascent can provide. Yes, questions?
explain a bit more the difference between SENSEI and Ascent? Is it the same capability, just different user interfaces, or is it something fundamentally different?
So the question is about differences between SENSEI and Ascent, and they're different. So one of the things is that Ascent tries to be lightweight in everything, right? And it uses mainly VTKM for its analysis. And SENSEI is different. They try to provide different backends, or including VTKM, right? And including Ascent. There are differences that may be minor or major depending on how you look at, but the purpose is the same. And at some point, I predict that both projects will be converging to this kind of the same guidelines. So we'll see. But we're trying to support both. So this is a brief overview of the things that you can do in terms of visualization. So if you build Ascent, it comes with these capabilities already, right? So you can do clips, and Joe already described this kind of base operations. You can do clips, isovolume, thresholding, slices, or contours, and it can do rendering as well, right? So you can do volume rendering, or render meshes, or do pseudo-color plots. Since I'm gonna run out of time soon, I'm just gonna skip this. The language bindings in Ascent for the time being, C and C++, Python and Fortran, and it can output HDF files or adios. And this is and Cinema here. This is something we didn't touch on previously. Cinema is an image database, essentially, created for in situ. So the purpose here is that reduce, if we create images for every time step of the data from multiple angles, right, or for multiple variables at the same time, we create those images, put it in a database that we can explore later, we still reduce the data significantly. Right? And they proved that in a paper in SC14. I'll invite you to read that paper. But it's about creating image databases that you can explore offline. Something important in Ascent as the mini apps that you can try. So it comes already integrated with this Cloverleaf, Lule, Scriptkey, and Smooth Noise. So you build it, and you can already run it and test it with this included data sources. So with that, I'll move on to show you some additional resources and links. So you will have this on the slides that will be online. For SENSEI, that's the project webpage. There's a repo hosted at Kitware, and there's a tutorial, including slides and a virtual machine that you can run, right? So you can download that, run it on your own workstation. So that was the SC18 tutorial. There's one for ISC19, and we'll be doing together a tutorial in SC19. So SENSEI and Ascent will be doing a full day tutorial at SC19. So if you're there, I'll invite you to attend. And these are resources for Ascent. Again, website, their GitHub repo, and contact information. With that, we will conclude our presentation just in time. I would like to also let you know that we are looking for postdocs to work in our team. So if any of you is interested or know a person, talk to Joe and I, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, I was wondering, in the XML file that you show for SENSEI,
Yes.
How flexible is that? I'm thinking, for example, I would like to run a simulation.
Yes.
And at every time step, I want to generate an image.
Yes.
But at the same time, at every 10 time steps, I want to say the full snapshot. Is that possible?
That is possible. So the question is about the flexibility in XML files that you pass to SENSEI. And it's trying to do multiple things, like creating images in every time step, or saving the data every 10 time steps, and that is possible. You can configure the frequency for each for many of those backends. So yes, that's possible. Question there.
So, seeing as these applications seem to stream your data and reuse the same data structures from your analysis code, so does that mean if you have one of these, are calling one of these software packages in sort of a loop, like a tight loop, then you're going to be slowing down your actual...
That's correct. Yes, that's true. So the question is about sharing data from simulation to analysis, right? And if we're running in Situ, which means that we're running on the same node and sharing the memory, yes, we will be, the simulation in general should block until the analysis is done using the data. In another configuration, which is in transit, we call it in transit, it may have multiple names or like loosely coupled, you move the data to a different set of nodes, right? So perhaps there may be a penalty of moving data through the network, right? But the simulation can keep going after that. So there are those trade-offs, and it depends on your application, right? And there's a lot of research going on in terms of finding optimal cases for that. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there a difference between saving the state in a Python script and the catalyst?
So you can, you can save the state in, the question is about saving the state in peer review and creating the Python script for Catalyst. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar. So you can save your state in Python, but the Python script that you generate for Catalyst is a little bit more specific. And Dave may correct me if I'm wrong, right?
When you, in peer review, you're going through the Python path to Catalyst. If you save the state, it's going to make basically a Python script, but it's wrapped in such a way that the rest of the in-situ architecture knows how to call it automatically. So it's subtly different. That's what we were saying. And we can talk about it later. Okay.
Right. Any other questions? Yes.
You visualize like two attributes at the same time with slightly different view format and sync.
You mean from Catalyst or in any general, and more general application? Yeah. You could do that. In fact, I showed that for that histogram example, right? You could be looking at ID or particle type and do different operations with them, right? So yes, it is possible to do multiple things with the same data. Yes. No questions about this? That was really clear? Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll be around for the rest of the day. If there are more questions, we'll be happy to take them, all right?